So the question I asked on NOSTR the other day was, what does every Bitcoiner need? And I was going to like specify in terms of like tools, hardware devices, apps, things. That's kind of what I was looking for, but I didn't want to specify because I wanted it to be an open question. And so I got a lot of really good answers with it. So the question was, what does every Bitcoiner need to have? And so I'm going to go through a couple that other people shared. And then I'm going to give my list that I had. I thought I had it here. Oh, it's right here. All right. So we had Danny who said a healthy dose or healthy distrust of authority and a hardware wallet. And I think that's, you'd have a hard time finding a Bitcoiner who has full trust in government. So I think that just comes inherently. But a hardware wallet is a good place to start. And I would say for anybody out there who's like trying to get their first hardware wallet, I would suggest the Blockstream Jade or Foundation Passport, or if you're a little bit more advanced, Cold Card. Cold Card is probably where you want to get to eventually. It's just can be kind of difficult for somebody who's somewhat new to Bitcoin. Not that it's hard, it's just you have to know what you're doing there. So I would say one of those three things in terms of a hardware wallet. The next one here was from Royster, who said a grove of giant sequoia trees. So it kind of ties into what we've been talking about today in terms of owning land versus Bitcoin, or selling your land to buy Bitcoin, or holding your land instead of buying Bitcoin. And again, I think that that's kind of every Bitcoiner's end goal here for the most part. Like if you took a survey of all the Bitcoiners on earth and say, like, what are you hoping to do with your Bitcoin one day? I think that the majority of them would say something along the lines of, own 30 acres somewhere, or have an acreage for my family that we can keep for generations, or a grove of giant sequoia trees. So if you're ever thinking about like selling your land to buy Bitcoin, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You're basically buying Bitcoin so you can eventually one day have land. That's kind of my thoughts on it. So I think that's a good one. I think that every Bitcoiner should have their own citadel at some point. The next one here was from Jeannie. And this is kind of what led me to this conversation here, but it said a full spectrum independent lifestyle that operates outside of the system, which includes food, energy, information, health, finance, and community. So this is something that is going to take a lot of time for people to sort out. But I think the one thing that I would say is just take this whole thing very slow and think long term. Give yourself like 4 or 5 years to do all this stuff. So again, a full spectrum independent lifestyle that operates outside of the system. So food, energy, information, health, finance, and community. And a few of those things you can do pretty quickly, I think, honestly. Like start, if you have a house, you have any access to like a small chunk of a property, just start growing a garden. You can do it this summer. And we have something now that nobody had before us, which is YouTube and AI and anything. You can just learn quickly on what to plant, best growing conditions, where to get the seed, all that kind of stuff. It's never been easier for somebody to start gardening for themselves. Energy. I mean, you can make slow purchases with this too, in terms of like getting a backup generator, getting a separate generator, maybe getting some solar somewhere on your roof or somewhere else. I don't know. It depends where you live, but you should be able to have your own energy. And if you don't have like a source of resources, then again, just get like a backup generator and some gas. Information. I think that everybody's kind of already down that rabbit hole. If you're on NOSTR, if you're watching the show right now, you're probably accessing independent media, which is kind of crazy. I never really stop and consider, my audience or who watches me, but this channel is basically just like alternative media from the mainstream narrative. So you're kind of already got that checked off. Health is a different one, depends where you live. Finance, if you own Bitcoin, you're already part of that. And community. I think community is probably the biggest part of this, because I go into the theory that the more Bitcoiners you know, the faster you can leave the existing system, because you can start interacting with them. You can start transacting with them. They have a product they're selling, you have Bitcoin. You have a product you're selling, they have Bitcoin. You can sell things back and forth. You can trade essentially in a system that's outside of the legacy. So community. And a big part of that is actually your reputation and your web of trust. And so the best thing, and I know that there's a lot of people here who are in this community right now, and the longer you're in a community like that, the more trust you're going to have and the more willing that other people within that network are going to be to transact with you. So you should definitely be in a community, whether it's like the Living in the Future community that we have, or I was going to say Orange Pill app, but I don't know if that's a real community or not, but it's something like that where you can start to build your own networks. But that's what I would say is like something like the Living in the Future. And if you don't want to be part of this one, there's probably more out there, but Living in the Future is the best one by far. Dave says, an awareness of how early we are. I think this is so important because if people understood how early we are, they would take things a little bit more seriously in terms of like, working a couple of extra hours a day to buy more sats, or, going through a couple steps in terms of maybe setting up a ShakePay Visa where you can earn sats back, or taking 10 minutes a day to take a survey or a poll on ZBD, or listen to a song on Wavelake, or anything. If people understood how early we are and how scarce these sats are, I think there'd be a lot more urgency from Bitcoiners. So that's a really good one from Dave. And then there's a couple other ones. Pro said kids, which I agree with. Satoshi Satadi, I don't know, said non-KYC Bitcoin. Matt said an NPub. Logan said a node. Bismarck Bitcoin said a start 9. And Notorious DRC said friends who get it. Friends who get it. That's a big one. We kind of started the show talking about that today. So you got to have a couple friends in your life that you can talk Bitcoin and conspiracies with. Otherwise, you're going to be hurting. And that ties into the community here. So a lot of these things are actually going to tie in together. But I think that this is kind of my list. So this is the Bitcoiners checklist. And I actually talked about this in the day 36 of 365 yesterday. But I think it's worth talking about again because this is... So what I would suggest is get like a piece of paper, get a notepad, write this down, and give yourself 4 years. That's kind of what my advice for this would be. Give yourself 4 years. You don't have to do this all at once. You don't have to panic. You should be urgent, but you shouldn't be like stressed out about it. Give yourself 4 years. And if you can check off all these things on your list, you're going to be in a much better spot than you are today. So number one, we just talked about it, but have a solid network of Bitcoiners, whether that's something like Living in the Future community, whether that's local meetups that you do, but you should have a solid group of Bitcoiners that you can bounce ideas off of, learn from, transact with. You should have be part of a solid network and have some time in that network so that people can gain your trust. Trust is going to be a big one because you have to keep in mind here, the whole premise of Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer way to transact. And when there's nobody in the middleman, when there's no middleman there, there's no insurance. It all is based around trust. In the current system, we basically don't need to trust each other to transact. We have things like insurance. We have things like PayPal guarantees and chargebacks, everything. It's bad. You should be able to trust each other, but you have to earn that trust. And so the sooner you can join like a solid Bitcoin network, I think, again, the better off you're going to be in the future for a lot of ways. Number 2 is non-KYC Bitcoin. And I don't want people to obsess over this, but I think it should be in the back of your mind that you should be actively trying to get as much non-KYC Bitcoin as possible. So kind of my theory on this is that I think if everybody's obsessed with getting non-KYC Bitcoin, we have to be very secretive and not private, but if it's going to be hard for people, then Bitcoin's failed. If everybody's going to have to worry about their government coming down on them or their whatever, if we get to a spot where people are going to need KYC Bitcoin, then I think Bitcoin's failed personally. I don't think it's going to happen, but I still think you should aim towards getting like 10, 15, 20% of your total stack being Bitcoin that nobody knows you have. And there's a whole slew of ways to do this, whether it's a peer-to-peer exchange, whether it's adding value on NOSTR and getting non-KYC sats, There's a ton of different ways to do it, but you should be actively trying to get more non-KYC Bitcoin, and make sure you keep it separate too. Make sure you're being very organized with your wallets and where you're sending Bitcoin to, because if you had a big stash of non-KYC Bitcoin and all of a sudden you mixed it in with something else that you have KYC'd, then the whole stack's spoiled. So you got to be careful with it. Number 3 is an NPub, which you can get on NOSTR. Been talking about NOSTR quite a bit. We'll continue to talk about it, but every Bitcoiner should have their own NPub. So I got a lot of different videos on my channel here about NOSTR. I'm not going to get too far into it, but I think it is a key component to being a Bitcoiner is to have your own NPub and manage it well. And part of your reputation, part of your network is going to come from your NPub on NOSTR. So don't take it for granted. Don't take it lightly, but just start doing it, as soon as you can here. Number 4 is a Bitcoin node. So I would kind of combine 4 and 5 here, which is a Bitcoin node and a Start9, where you can actually run a node off of a Start9. But this little device here has been very impressed with it. Very impressed with it. And, I kind of waited a few years before actually investing in a Start9, having my own server and running a node, which is probably too long, I would say, for most people. But when you're first getting into Bitcoin, I don't think it's a great idea to just go out and spend a whole bunch of money on running a node. I don't think it's important at that stage. I think your sats would be much better spent on Bitcoin, or your money would be much better spent on Bitcoin instead of Start9. But if you have the means, like, don't go into credit card debt, don't put it on your line of credit, don't sell some Bitcoin for it. But if you have the financial means, you should absolutely be running one of these Start9 servers. And even if you buy it and just kind of put it on the shelf for a little while and get to it, when you have some time, just do it, because these things are going to be very handy, very useful in the future. And I think that you should be working towards just like getting good with it, because there's going to be a lot of things that you can do outside of the system on one of these things. And if you know how to use it and what it's capable of, again, that's kind of where you want to get to there. So a Start9, that also ties into the non-KYC Bitcoin. There's a couple different apps on the marketplace within Start9 where you can actually buy and sell Bitcoin peer-to-peer. And if I remember, I'll put, again, don't go into debt. Don't go into financial difficulties trying to get a Start9. But if you have the means, I have a link. So you get 5% off, I think, Start9. It saves you about $65 US off one of these things. So if I remember, I'll put it in the show notes for everybody there. But I think you can buy one. And if you use the code 88SATS, it should apply the discount. But I'll put the link in the notes here. The next one, number 6, is cold storage. Everybody should have their Bitcoin in cold storage, especially after 4 years. If you're somewhat new to Bitcoin and you're not really there yet, that's okay. But you should eventually definitely take the keys to your Bitcoin and put it into cold storage using like a hardware device like we talked about. Jade, Passport, or Cold Card. Number 7 is a will. A will. Again, if you took a random survey of 1,000 Bitcoiners, I would say that probably maybe 10 would have a will. The inheritance stuff is going to be such a huge wrench in the Bitcoiner ecosystem over the next couple of years. So definitely have a will. You can get one very easily online now. I think you just use a service like Willful, where you pay a couple $100, you get a will, at least a template, and then you just have it. Like just get it done. Because I think the last thing you want to do is, if something were to ever happen to you, you don't want to leave your family with a huge fucking mess to clean up. And so if you have a will, at least that way it skips like the whole being held up in probate and going through the courts and all your information becoming public. At least if you have a will and you have a solid plan in place, you kind of avoid that. And so that's something that Craig and myself have been kind of implementing. We're not really at that stage yet, but it's going to be part of the process there with the inheritance protocol, where you actually get yourself a will. Maybe you set up a revocable trust. We kind of help you through that all. But then you just, the nice thing about that is you completely skip the whole court system, probate, where all of your financial information, all your Bitcoin would be made public. You do not want to do that to your family. So just start simply with a will. Then, maybe a revocable trust, but get some help with it. Take it seriously. I think that, again, this is the biggest part of Bitcoin, and I think it's the most slept on part of Bitcoin. So the last one here is get yourself either a multi-sig setup or encrypted, or both. And you want to set yourself up in a position where if somebody were to ever get into your house through force or while you're gone or whatever, or your house burns down, you want to be in a spot where your Bitcoin is going to survive that. And a multi-sig is the best way to do that, where you kind of remove the single point of failure there. So you have a multi-sig. It's a little bit more complex to set up, but you can, again, do something like with SuperBacked, which, again, we're hopefully going to have Craig on here on Friday where we can talk about it and answer some questions. But that's kind of where you want to get to, is either having a multi-sig or encrypted backups or both. And so that's my list of 8 things for the Bitcoiners checklist.